and he was called out in emergency because the electricity was on and off. It was during the miners' strike, and unusually his boss went with him.
In actual fact, on the Saturday the job had been completed, but his boss had insisted on coming in on the Sunday for him to go through the whole process again.
And he was working, I don't know what, repairing it, and he was standing on a steel door, trap door, I think.
So he was handed these keys, and I don't know exactly how it happened or what went wrong, but he inserted these keys into this, I think it was like a turbine or a spout or something.
And as I understand it, the labourer handed him the wrong brass key, and it caused an explosion, and he was electrocuted, caught fire with all this black oil coming out, and until then I hadn't realised that oil and electric was, part and parcel of it.
I can't really recall exactly what they called this bit of equipment, but the next thing, apparently there was a massive explosion, and all this boiling oil came out of this spout and caught my husband, who was in flames, and it knocked his boss down into what they called a gantry.
And he literally was on fire, and he was conscious all that time.
And there was junior engineers, obviously not in that particular room, but who were outside in another part of the station. They rang immediately for the fire brigade and the police, and the place was absolutely full of smoke, and my husband was in flames, and he'd obviously had about 22,000 volts go through him. How on earth he survived, we will never know.
First we knew of it was when Josie, that's his wife, phoned and told my husband that Danny was being rushed to hospital, and they took him to Fulham first, but then they rushed him to East Grinstead with police escort. And my husband, who was very, very queasy, up to that moment, he only had to watch something gory on the television and he'd go white and couldn't face it. Anyway, we rushed down to Watford.
In the meantime, I rang Danny's sister Marge and my brother-in-law John, and within a very short while they came over, and in the meantime there was one of the senior engineers had rung me to say he'd come over to show me he offered actually to take me down, but my brother-in-law John said no, he would take me.
And John and Josie went down to East Grinstead.
How it was arranged was that there was a corridor around all the little wards.
And John, it done something to him, because normally he would have fainted, because when they got there, Danny was in like a tent thing, no clothes on, because he was covered in black oil, all burnt to his skin. In fact, later on, we were told it burnt to the bone. You could see his bones on his legs.
Right, he was in this isolation ward. All the wards were isolated, and you couldn't go into them. You had to look through this window at them. And my husband was very heavily sedated, and it was a terrible shock to see him. My brother-in-law, who won't mind me saying, he was a bit squeamish about things, and he was really upset to see him. I mean, he just had a little modesty cloth across his body, but his left leg was absolutely massive. And his head, he looked as if he'd had tar tipped over him.
His hair had all gone, tops of his ears had all gone.
and he was, as I say, he was heavily sedated. So there was nothing we could do, really. So we went back to the reception area, and the head sister spoke to us, and she said that he's extremely ill. He's had 33.5% of his body burn.
And I've never known a man have to suffer so many years. It was unnatural, because he had operation after operation after operation, and yet he still kept a decent humour, didn't he? He did. I mean, at one time when they sewed his legs together to try and get skin to graft, it didn't work. And after years and years, they took a lump, and I mean a lump, off of his back with muscle and stretched it like a sheet over his leg.
And he'd had loads of skin grafts prior to this, of course. They used to take skin off his tops of his thighs, and even till many years later, you could still see the area where they removed the skin. He'd had a lot of skin grafts on his head, but basically the worst part of it that was burnt was his left leg. He had loads of skin grafts, but because the burns were from below his knee, down his shin bone and round the side to his calves and everything, the skin was it was like tissue paper. And he lost one of his ears. So in later life, when he had to wear spectacles, it was a great job for him to keep a pair of glasses on. The kids were taking the mickey out of because their father wore this wig, and when we eventually plucked up courage to go into Watford, there was business things we had to sort out, going to the bank and things like that. He shuffled along. He had slippers with great holes cut out so that he could walk easier. The children went through an awful time, and I think, looking back, it definitely changed his personality. He used to have terrible nightmares. He accepted what they offered. He didn't want to actually go into court, and we didn't want to have an actual court case. I don't think he could have stood it. And so him and his boss settled for what they gave him. And of course, over the years, things were never the same again. He went back to work full time in September 1972. We didn't want him to go back to work, but we was only on a certain amount of pay, and but he was determined to go back and get back into work, and he didn't retire, finished working until he was 60, and that was in 1991. In between that time, he'd had several operations, and his health definitely was deteriorated.
But he was a spirited man, because he ended up in a wheelchair, and he used to go shopping and get big shopping things. And at one time, he got, I don't know if it was planks of wood or hardboard or what, but he had this sticking out front and back, and somehow balanced it and got it home doing it. He was unique, he really was.